Today's story will take us on a super attractive, emotional journey. The story of an orphan boy, despised by society, but dared to stand up and challenge fate to reach his dream of becoming the greatest magician. Let's explore. In a certain land, there was a famous hunter named Vincent. He was an experienced man with a muscular body and sharp senses like a predator. Vincent lived with his beautiful wife named Olina, a gentlewoman who made anyone turn their eyes. But their life was missing a piece. They were infertile, unable to have children. Then one quiet night, when the faint moonlight shone on the forest, Vincent suddenly heard a soft cry echoing from the stable. At first, he thought it was just the sound of a lost wild animal. But when he picked up a wooden stick and tiptoed towards it, Vincent was stunned. In the middle of the dry straw, a white baby with shiny golden hair, wrapped in a blanket, lay there, his eyes clear as if he had just finished crying. Time passed, the boy grew up, becoming a teenager with bright golden hair and blue eyes, as beautiful as an angel. Vincent and Olina named him Shirone, a treasure given by heaven. To them, Shirone was no different from their own son. Every day, when the sun just rose above the hills, Vincent took the boy with him, teaching him how to survive, hunt, and even stories about the big world out there. Shirone, with her radiant smile, was always the pride of the couple. In the early mornings, when Vincent was busy chopping wood, the sound of the gong echoed steadily through the forest. Shirone would sit under the tree, engrossed in turning the pages of the magic books his foster father had bought for him. The old books, with frayed leather covers, contained many mysteries about the magical world, as if whispering great dreams to the boy. He read voraciously, his blue eyes sparkling, completely immersed in his own world. But their family life, although warm, was not completely peaceful. The children in the village did not like Shirone. The reason was simple. He was always buried in books, never participating in mischief like them. Moreover, Shirone looked thin, frail, with soft blonde hair, a somewhat weak appearance like a girl, far from Vincent's strong, muscular body. To the children, Shirone was like an outcast. The gossips in the village did not leave him alone. They sat huddled under the tree, whispering to each other that Shirone was not Vincent and Olina's biological child, that he was an abandoned child, picked up by the couple from some corner. Those rumors, although true, were like sharp knives, stabbing straight into Vincent's heart. He considered Shirone a treasure, the light of his life, so every whisper hurt him. But Shirone, that boy, never opened his mouth to complain. He just quietly read books, as if the pages were the safest shelter. Vincent often blamed himself. He thought, perhaps because of him, Shirone was shunned by the children, despised by the world. Many times, he just wanted to rush forward, shout at the naughty children or those gossipy women. But then, he held back. Vincent knew that raising his fist would not solve anything. What he hoped for most was that one day, Shirone would prove his worth to the whole world. To ease his guilt, Vincent decided to take Shirone out often, broadening his horizons. He wanted him to see how big the world was, so that the gossip in the village would no longer matter. That morning, Vincent took Shirone to Chris City, a bustling place on the outskirts of the Tormia kingdom. For Shirone, this was his first time setting foot in an urban area. He was amazed by the luxury and bustle of the city, the sparkling cobblestone streets, the bustling cries of vendors, and the splendid horse-drawn carriages passing by. Shirone's blue eyes were shining, as if he wanted to embrace this new world. Vincent still had some things to take care of, so he stopped the carriage in front of a fruit shop owned by an acquaintance named Martin. He led Shirone in, telling him to stay there and wait for his father to return. Although Shirone was obedient, Vincent couldn't help but feel nervous. This was the boy's first time in the city, where everything was strange and full of temptations. He grabbed Shirone's shoulder, looked straight into his eyes, and told him over and over again, don't wander around, especially in dark alleys, and don't mess with the nobles. They're not easy to deal with. Only when he saw Shirone nod firmly did Vincent feel assured and drove away. Shirone stayed at the fruit shop, not willing to sit still, and decided to help Martin. He quickly arranged the fruits and carefully wrote the price list in clear, neat handwriting. Martin's eyes widened in surprise. A boy from the countryside like Shirone could read and write, and was also so smart and quick-witted. He stared intently at the blonde-haired boy with blue eyes, who worked with a rare intelligence. While Martin was still admiring him, Shirone suddenly looked up and asked curiously, Mr. Martin, do you know anything about magic? Martin was stunned. What? Peeling magic? Shirone shook his head and seriously corrected, no, it's magic. He excitedly pulled out a thick, worn-out, leather-bound magic book from his pocket that Vincent had bought for him. His eyes were shining, as if the whole world was contained within those pages. Martin laughed. Children are children, always dreaming of lofty things, knights, heroes, magicians. But seeing Shirone's eyes sparkling with anticipation, he couldn't bear to disappoint him. Martin scratched his head, then pointed to the small alley in front of the shop. I don't know much about magic. He said, but there's a used bookstore over there full of books about magic. You should check it out. Shirone looked in the direction Martin was pointing, his blue eyes immediately lighting up. At the end of the alley, a large bookstore appeared, as if it was beckoning him. With Martin's permission, he didn't hesitate, immediately rushing towards it, eager as a bird about to take flight. But as soon as he entered the store, Shirone was stopped by the domineering owner. With a disdainful expression, she shouted, "Hey kid, don't touch the books. These books are very expensive, not for poor people like you." Shirone was stunned, his heart ached, but his eyes still sparkled with curiosity. At that moment, a customer walked in, causing the owner to change her attitude immediately. She warmly called him head butler, although it was unclear which prestigious family he served. While the owner was busy entertaining the guests, Shirone stealthily approached the bookshelf. He quickly flipped through a few books, but was deeply disappointed. The content inside was dry, not as interesting as he had expected. As Shirone walked out of the store, he saw a man carrying a box of old books passing by. The pile of dusty, worn-out books seemed to have a strange attraction for him. As a bookworm, Shirone didn't think twice and immediately ran after the man, his heart filled with excitement. Shirone was stunned when he saw the man mercilessly dump the whole box of books into the trash. The old books, with frayed covers and dusty covers, were lying haphazardly among the scrap. So this is where my father picked up my books? Shirone stood there in a daze for a few seconds, his heart sinking. But then he walked over, carefully picked up each book, and brushed off the dust, as if they were treasures. While he was absorbed in his thoughts, Shirone suddenly heard the sound of cheerful laughter. Looking up, he saw two noble girls, dressed in gorgeous clothes, happily chatting. Each of them held a book, flipping through it with delight. Shirone was stunned, his heart filled with questions. Why were they different from him? Why did his father tell him not to get involved with nobles? And why were they free to read the books they liked, while he was chased away like a lowly person? Thinking of this, Shirone unconsciously followed the two girls, his heart eager to find the answer. But before he could chase after him, a strong hand grabbed his shoulder. A tall guard with cold eyes stopped him. His deep voice rang out, "Hey, kid, where are you going?" Shirone stood still, his heart pounding, not knowing what was waiting for him ahead. "Hey, kid, this is no place for the likes of you to hang around," the guard shouted, his eyes as sharp as knives. "Through this gate is the area reserved for nobles. Where are your parents?" Shirone was confused and stammered, "Father, my father lives nearby." Just then, another soldier stepped forward. He glanced at Shirone from head to toe, frowning. This blonde, skinny boy dressed in simple clothes did not resemble the children living around here at all. "This kid must be an orphan or a lackey of bandits," he whispered to his colleague. Without saying a word, both of them rushed forward, intending to grab Shirone for questioning. But Shirone was quick as lightning. He ripped off his coat, broke free from the soldier's grasp, and dashed away. He dove into the nearby flower bushes, his heart pounding, his hair disheveled, his clothes covered in mud. Even so, Shirone was still lucky that he hadn't been caught. Just as he was about to pick up his lost shoes and return to Mr. Martin, he suddenly heard a voice coming from behind the large wall. The voice, full of mystery, as if whispering something important, made Shirone unable to help but tiptoe closer. "Now let's discuss the topic. What is magic?" A deep voice rang out. But immediately a few cheers interrupted. "No, principal. Show us fire." The excited voices, mixed with cheerful laughter, made Shirone curiously raise his head. He looked up at the surrounding wall that was twice or three times as tall as him, but saw nothing but cold stones. "Wait, is this a magic academy?" Shirone muttered, a feeling of excitement rising in his heart. He pressed his ear against the wall, listening attentively, as if afraid of missing any sound. Inside, the so-called principal continued to ask the students, "What is the most important thing when learning magic?" Someone answered, "Knowledge." Another person spoke up, "It's hard work." A bold voice even declared, "The most important thing is money." Laughter rang out, but the principal remained silent, as if waiting for a more proper answer. Shirone held his breath, trying to listen carefully, his heart pounding. Finally, the principal's deep voice rang out, revealing the answer he had been waiting for. "The most important thing when learning magic is insight," the principal's voice rang out, deep and deep like a prophecy. Inside the walls, the students from noble families were stunned, their faces bewildered. "Insight? What is that?" A few murmurs rang out, revealing confusion. The principal did not rush to explain. He calmly asked back, "Is there anyone here who doesn't know what 1 + 1 equals?" The students burst into laughter, answering in unison, "Who doesn't know? It's 2, of course." The laughter erupted, confident as if it were an obvious truth. But the principal continued to ask, "So can anyone explain why 1 + 1 equals 2? The students were stunned, looking at each other. No one spoke. The space suddenly became strangely silent. "That strange feeling you're experiencing right now," the headmaster said slowly, "is clarity. There was a time when people didn't know that 1 + 1 equals 2. Many maesters worked hard, argued endlessly, just to prove it. But even without clear evidence, we still feel that 1 + 1 = 2, right? Shirone, outside the wall, held his breath and listened. The headmaster's words were like a ray of light, awakening something deep within him. That's because it's a rule that has always existed in this world, the headmaster continued, his voice resonating as if awakening the entire space. We don't need to learn that 1 + 1 = 2, because we naturally understand and accept it. The same goes for magic. It has existed in this world since the beginning. We feel and accept it with our own wisdom. That's why wisdom is more important than knowledge or hard work. Inside the academy, the noble students were still bewildered, unable to fully comprehend those profound words. But Shirone, who was secretly pressing his ear against the wall, felt his heart pounding. The headmaster's words were like a bright light, lighting up hope in his heart. The most important thing to learn magic is not money, nor is it noble status, but wisdom, Shirone muttered, his eyes shining. Then, a child like me can also become a great mage, right? Thinking of this, Shirone felt both excited and nervous. He clenched his fists, feeling like the whole world was opening up before his eyes, and that great dream suddenly became closer than ever. Shirone's heart was pounding, almost jumping out of his chest when the principal's voice suddenly rang out deep and sharp. The child is eavesdropping behind that wall. I want to hear your thoughts. Shirone was startled and panicked. How could this be? With such a thick wall, the principal still discovered him. He stood still, his mind in turmoil. Should he run away or answer? He looked extremely miserable at the moment. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were covered in mud, and one of his shoes was missing. Shirone was worried. Would the principal and those noble students despise him like the bookstore owner or the 2 guards, considering him a poor, dirty person? But deep inside, another voice rang out, urging, if you miss this opportunity, you will regret it for the rest of your life. With a strong motivation, Shirone gritted his teeth, using his small body to cling to the wall. Step by step, he climbed, his limbs trembling but his eyes shining, sparkling with determination. Despite his shabby appearance, his blue eyes were like fire, burning with desire and courage. When he reached the top of the wall, Shirone took a deep breath, ready to face what awaited on the other side. Shirone looked over the wall and saw the principal of the Magic Academy sitting under a tree, surrounded by a few children. He looked kind, his eyes warm, not at all like the fierce bookstore owner or the cold guards. As soon as he saw Shirone peeking out, he smiled and spoke first. Hello, are you here to play with me? That man was Mirhi Alpheas, a famous 4th-level mage, the founder of the Alpheas Magic Academy. Shirone took a deep breath, gathered his courage, and jumped down from the wall. He walked closer step by step, his heart still pounding. The children sitting around Alpheas were all children of noble families, their clothes clean, their appearance luxurious, completely different from Shirone with his dirty appearance and messy hair. A few of them glanced at him, immediately realizing that he was just a commoner, they whispered, and even bluntly chased him away. Go away, dirty boy. But Principal Alpheas raised his hand to stop him, his voice gentle. It's okay, just come here. Did I say something that attracted you? The kindness in his eyes and words made Shirone feel less self-conscious. He raised his head, his blue eyes sparkling, feeling like a new door had just opened before him. Although he was still shy, Shirone still mustered up the courage to speak his mind. I want to see magic, he mumbled, his voice trembling but full of determination. I've only seen it in books, never seen it in real life. Before Alpheas could reply, the noble students surrounding him began to clamor, Liar! How can a commoner like him know how to read? Some of them mocked him, looking at Shirone with contempt. He lowered his head, knowing that he had no voice among these people. But he still pleaded softly, his voice sincere. Please, any magic is fine. I just want to see it with my own eyes. Alpheas laughed, his hearty laughter seeming to dispel all tension. Ha, it's simple. I'll show you a magic that creates wind. As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his hand slightly. A strong wind suddenly blew, sending Shirone flying into the air. Not only him, the group of noble children sitting around the principal were also lifted by the wind, floating in the air, screams and laughter resounding throughout the garden. The noble children were floating in the air, all of them screaming with joy, as if they were enjoying a magical game. But Shirone was different. He was both frightened and confused, his eyes wide open, his heart pounding. When the wind brought them all to a certain height, they all began to fall freely. The students were still laughing loudly, extremely excited, but Shirone felt like his heart was about to jump out of his chest. This was the first time he had experienced the feeling of free falling, and from such a terrifying height, thinking that he was about to be crushed to pieces, he closed his eyes tightly, his whole body trembling. Only after a while, when the howling wind in his ears disappeared, leaving only the children's giggles, did Shirone dare to open his eyes. He was surprised to realize that he was floating only about a meter above the ground, safe and light. The magic school students looked at him, burst out laughing, teasing him. So cowardly, do you think you're going to die? Shirone blushed, embarrassedly lowering his head. But Principal Alpheas, witnessing this scene, couldn't help but burst into a hearty laugh. Echoing throughout the garden, he looked at Shirone, his eyes sparkling with affection and encouragement. How does it feel? That's magic. Alpheas smiled, looking at Shirone, who had just safely landed. The boy was still trembling, his heart pounding from the shock. Magic, was it like this? It was magical, magnificent, far beyond what he had read in those old books. What exactly is magic, headmaster? Shirone stuttered, his voice filled with curiosity, still unable to shake off the feeling of being overwhelmed. Alpheas stroked his long beard, pondering, as if trying to find an easy-to-understand explanation for the boy. But Shirone, too eager, couldn't help but urge him, "Tell me the truth." His voice rang out louder than he intended, to the point that outsiders might think he was being disrespectful to the headmaster. The surrounding noble students widened their eyes in surprise. No one, not even the teachers in the school, would dare to speak so loudly to Alpheas, a fourth-level mage, the founder of the academy, like that. They whispered, looking at Shirone with eyes that were both surprised and annoyed, but Alpheas just smiled, his eyes still gentle, as if he didn't care about the boy's boldness. The noble students were sure that Alpheas would throw a tantrum and punish Shirone for his bold tone, but when he looked at his intelligent face and bright eyes, Alpheas just laughed, not angry at all. "Ha ha! If you're that curious, I'll explain it a little more complicatedly." He stroked his long beard, his eyes sparkling, and began to talk about something called magic. Magic, simply put, is something that goes beyond common sense. It is the expansion of the mind to discover the truth of the world. Even though it's unrealistic, it's because of that it's closer to the truth. Shirone listened attentively, then suddenly spoke up. "So is it because it's unrealistic that it's closer to the truth?" Alpheas was stunned, his face showing excitement. Shirone's question was so sharp that even the well-educated noble students sitting here had never realized it on their own. "Did you read this in a book?" he asked, curious. Shirone shook his head, his voice firm. "No, but I noticed similarities between many books." The surrounding students were stunned, but Alpheas smiled, his eyes shining with respect for this commoner boy. Many ideas of great people were once considered absurd, laughed at, and dismissed. But in the end, everyone had to accept that it was the newly discovered truth. So, the truth, perhaps, is always hidden in those seemingly absurd things. That's what I think, Shirone said, his voice firm but still a little embarrassed. Alpheas listened, nodding his head continuously, his beard quivering slightly. He was clearly very pleased with this intelligent, bright boy. Despite his difficult background, Shirone still tried to absorb and filter out the little information to deeply understand the problem. It was just a pity, as Alpheas thought, that he was a commoner. No matter how talented he was, the gap with the children of the nobility was still a difficult wall to overcome. Wanting Shirone to understand more about magic, Alpheas called out softly, "Schwamin, come here." A pink-haired, mischievous-looking girl walked over. He smiled, his voice warm. "Let this boy see the spiritual world." Schwamin nodded, his eyes sparkling, ready to carry out the principal's request, while Shirone stood there, heart pounding, eagerly waiting for a miracle to happen. Alpheas smiled, took out a handful of coins from his pocket, and turned to Schwamin. "Guess how many coins I have?" Schwamin answered without thinking, 6 coins. What stunned Shirone was that the answer was completely correct. His eyes widened, his mind exploding with tens of thousands of why questions. Seeing Shirone's surprised expression, Alpheas smiled slightly and explained, "When a mage is highly focused, their mind becomes sharp enough to perceive everything around them. Even excellent mage can count the number of leaves on a tree from a great distance. That is called an extremely sensitive mental state, also known as the spiritual world." As he spoke, Alpheas gently changed the number of coins in his hand. He asked Schwamin again, and this time, the pink-haired girl still guessed correctly, without any hesitation. Shirone stood there, stunned, feeling like the door to a magical world had just opened before his eyes, making his heart flutter with excitement and longing. "A mage who enters the spirit world perceives the outside world with supernatural powers," Alpheas explained, his eyes shining as if to inspire Shirone. "They can do not only small things like counting coins, but also perceive the entire situation happening right before their eyes. This is the most basic thing you need to grasp if you want to become a true mage. But not everyone can do it. The state of the spirit world is not easy to achieve." He looked at Shirone, his voice warm but full of encouragement. "First, you must perceive yourself. Find a quiet place, try to concentrate, then clear your mind of vague, chaotic thoughts. When you do that, a new world will open up for you to explore. Do you understand what I mean?" Shirone nodded, but still hesitated a bit, repeating as if to confirm, "What you mean is, if I can't feel myself, I won't be able to control my thoughts, right?" Alpheas smiled, nodding in satisfaction, as if seeing the brilliant potential in this commoner boy. Shirone hesitated, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "But what is the self after all?" His question surprised Alpheas again. He smiled, his eyes shining as if he had found a precious gem. "Try to feel yourself right here," Alpheas said, his voice low but full of challenge. "If you can't do it, I'm afraid it will be difficult for you to reach the door of magic." Shirone frowned, his heart in turmoil. What is the self? The brain is just an organ, and the senses, what he feels, seem to be limited by its concept. But Alpheas said, "It's not about understanding the meaning, but about feeling." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, tried to clear away the chaotic thoughts, and focused on himself. As time passed, sweat beaded on Shirone's forehead, soaking the back of his shirt. Finally, he opened his eyes. In front of him were still Principal Alpheas and the noble students. But there was something different, as if the world around him had become sharper. Alpheas looked at him, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "What do you feel?" Shirone's whole body was drenched in sweat. He took a breath, his voice trembling but certain. I feel clearer, as if everything in my head is no longer confused. It's like I'm really existing, sir." "Sound. I hear all sounds," Shirone replied, his voice still trembling from the effort. The surrounding noble children burst into laughter, mocking him. "Who can't hear sounds?" Alpheas said nothing, but his eyes flashed with disappointment. He had hoped that Shirone could do something special, but it seemed that this boy, as he had originally predicted, had not yet reached the necessary threshold. He explained in his heart, the spirit world was a completely different dimension. There, people perceived everything with strange senses, similar to synesthesia syndrome, when the brain processes information through multiple senses at the same time. Some people could smell sounds, taste light, or feel sights through their skin, but Shirone only said that he heard sounds, a clear sign that he had not entered the spirit world. However, Alpheas did not blame him. He slowly stood up, placed his hand on Shirone's head, and gently stroked it as if to comfort him. "It's okay," he said, his voice deep. "This isn't something everyone can do on their first try." Shirone bowed his head, feeling both regretful and longing, as if the magical door was still there, waiting for him to find a way to open it. "Very good. If you keep practicing, you will be able to hear more sounds in the future," Alpheas said, his voice encouraging, although deep down he felt a little regretful. Turning to the students, he signaled, "All right, this special lesson is over. Let's go back to school." As he led the children away, Alpheas couldn't help but think about Shirone. A smart child like him was rare. He secretly regretted that if Shirone had been born into a noble family and educated from a young age, perhaps his achievements would have far surpassed these students. But he put that aside and walked with the students. As for Shirone, he climbed over the wall and returned to the alley outside. But his mood was in turmoil, like waves surging in his heart. He knew that just now, he had truly touched the spiritual world. Shirone only told Alpheas that he heard sounds, but what he felt afterwards, he did not finish telling. There was something magical, like a sparkling light or a strange feeling running through his fingertips, something he couldn't describe. Shirone clenched his fists, his eyes sparkling with determination, knowing that the path of magic still awaited him ahead. After that shocking sound, Shirone felt as if his body was torn into hundreds of pieces, then stretched, spreading throughout the world. He was no longer a small entity, but as if he was the vast universe. That wonderful feeling caused Shirone's tears to unconsciously flow, rolling down his cheeks. He was overwhelmed, unable to hold back before the boundless vastness of the world. In just a short moment, Shirone escaped from his body, merging into a state of uncertainty, as if becoming a part of everything. That intense emotion made him unable to stand still. Shirone rushed forward, running on the road, as if wanting to release all the things that were surging in his heart. But because of that chaos, he accidentally bumped into a passerby. Shirone fell backwards, rolling on the ground, while the other person, a tall, sturdy man, only staggered slightly. I'm sorry." Shirone hurriedly bowed his head, stuttering, but the other guy, his eyes cold, didn't seem to want to let it go. He looked at Shirone, his lips curled into a threatening smile, as if waiting for the boy to suffer the consequences. There were a few other guys around the tall guy, and the one that Shirone bumped into immediately grabbed his collar, shouting, "Are you crazy, kid? You bumped into someone and don't know how to apologize?" Shirone panicked, stammering, I'm sorry. But the guy didn't listen, roaring, "Is apologizing enough? What gang are you in? Are you here to take my life?" Shirone was bewildered, not understanding what a gang was. He only knew that if this continued, he would be beaten to a pulp at best, and he would lose his life at worst. While he was panicking, a clear female voice suddenly rang out, "What are you guys doing? Is there something interesting?" The leader quickly turned around surprised. Miss Amy, why are you here? Are you bored again? Even though he said that, his hand still tightly gripped Shirone's collar, not letting go. The person called Miss Amy was a young, noble girl with fiery red hair, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. She walked forward, her confident demeanor causing everyone to unconsciously step back a little, but the leader's eyes were still full of vigilance, as if he was considering what this girl would do next. Shirone opened his mouth to ask for help, but when he saw that Amy was a noble, he immediately stopped. He remembered what his father told him not to get involved with nobles. Meanwhile, the thugs, after chatting with Amy for a while, returned to the main issue. Without saying a word, the leader threw a knee straight at Shirone's stomach. He fell to the ground, his whole body aching and writhing to the point that he just wanted to curl up. Bullying a skinny kid like Shirone not only didn't make the thugs feel ashamed, but also made them happy. They surrounded him, continuously hurling vulgar words, mocking Shirone, even bringing up his parents and insulting them with dirty words. Hearing them mention his parents like that, Shirone's eyes immediately changed. From fear, his eyes flared with anger and resentment. The thugs noticed this change, but only sneered. Before Shirone could react, a thunderous kick landed straight on his head. He fell down, his head spinning, feeling like the whole world was spinning before his eyes. The big thugs gathered around, taking turns beating Shirone. The small boy couldn't resist. He could only hold his head, gritting his teeth and enduring the continuous punches and kicks. Pain spread throughout his body, but he still bit his lips, not letting himself cry. After a while, Amy seemed unable to bear the sight anymore. She walked over, her voice cold. Stop. At this rate, the kid will really lose his life. She sat down next to Shirone, looking at him with an unfathomable gaze. Are you okay? Shirone, despite the pain, still felt a faint glimmer of hope from this girl. He cried and mumbled, I didn't do anything. I just happened to pass by. Amy curled her lips, turning to the thugs. Okay, stop now. Isn't there anything more fun? Shirone thought he was about to be saved, but Amy's eyes flashed with cruelty. To her, he was nothing more than a toy. She stood up and continued indifferently. We plan to beat her up and then sell her to the village to the south. Amy's words were like a knife, extinguishing Shirone's last hope. He lay there, his heart heavy, realizing that this red-haired noble girl was even more terrifying than those thugs. He's just a commoner. What's there to worry about? A thug spoke, his voice filled with contempt. Shirone was in despair, his heart falling into the abyss. He regretted not staying with Mr. Martin. If they really sold him, would he have the chance to see his parents again? He thought of Vincent and Olina, tears flowing unconsciously. Amy stared at Shirone, her eyes cold as if she was evaluating an item. Suddenly, she let out a strange laugh. A slave with flaws is not worth anything. How about I check it myself? The group of thugs surrounding her burst into laughter. Ha ha, Miss Amy. Are you really going to check it? One of them shouted at Shirone. Did you hear that, brat? She told you to take off your clothes. Hearing the two words, take off your clothes, Amy's expression immediately changed. She stepped back, looking confused. Actually, she just wanted to tease Shirone a bit and then let him go. But the thugs' jokes had taken things too far, and Shirone's panicked eyes made her feel a little guilty. The thugs, as if provoked by the joke, began to make a move. Shirone stood there, his eyes blazing with anger, as if he were about to explode. The laughter and threats of the thugs gradually faded from his mind. Instead, Shirone clearly heard the flapping of a dragonfly's wings, strangely sharp. The space around him seemed to freeze. Shirone's mind drifted back a few hours, as if time was rewinding. He saw Principal Alpheas again, sitting under a tree with the students. He was chanting an incantation, creating a magical wind to show him what real magic was. Shirone had no doubt about it. He was reliving his own memories. Alpheus's incantation appeared clearly in his mind, every syllable, every gesture, as if engraved into his mind. Everything blended together, transforming into Shirone's own stream of knowledge. He clenched his fists, feeling a strange power rising within him, as if the door to the magical world had just opened a little more. While Shirone's mind was lost in the world of memories, his body in reality stood still like a log. The thugs saw that he didn't react and became even more furious. The leader grabbed Shirone by the collar and roared, "Brat, are you deaf? Do I look like I'm joking?" Only Amy, with her sharp eyes, noticed something was wrong. She shouted, "Stop," but it was too late. Subconsciously, Shirone relied on the memories that had just resurfaced, muttering the spell that Alpheus had used. As if by instinct, he waved his hand, and a sudden tornado erupted, forcefully sweeping the thugs up into the sky. When Shirone regained his senses, they were already floating at a dizzying height, and then began to fall freely. With that distance, the sound of broken bones and painful groans when they hit the ground was not surprising. Shirone stood there, panting, his eyes still filled with astonishment, as if he couldn't believe he had just done it. Amy looked at him, her red-haired eyes filled with surprise and curiosity, as if she were looking at a completely different person. Shirone, with one move, had defeated nearly 10 thugs twice his size, without even understanding how he had done it. "Hey!" Amy shouted, her sharp voice pulling Shirone out of his reverie. "What the hell are you? Where did you learn magic? How does a commoner like you know how to use magic?" The red-haired girl looked at him, her eyes filled with surprise and doubt. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps rang out. A group of people attracted by the loud noise were running over. Amy glanced around, not wanting to get involved in a large crowd. She blinked, and as quick as a squirrel, she climbed to the roof of a nearby building and disappeared. Shirone stared, surprised by her speed, but there was no time to think too much. Before him was a chaotic scene, thugs lying around, groaning, their bones broken. The newcomers were approaching, their eyes filled with suspicion. Shirone knew they would never give him a chance to explain. His heart pounding, he had only one thought: run. If he was caught again, he was done for. He turned and dashed, running as fast as he could on the crowded street, determined not to get caught in this mess again. Shirone ran headlong, rushing out of that stuffy alley. The first time he left the village, he had to face many terrifying experiences. The world out there, it turned out, was scarier than he had imagined. He had only one burning desire: to return to his parents' arms, to return to the peaceful home where Vincent and Olina were waiting. That was enough. Meanwhile, Amy had returned to her magnificent mansion. The Karmis family, a first-class noble family, was where she grew up with all the privileges. But today, Amy returned home in a sullen mood, angry because a commoner like Shirone had humiliated her. Shakura, the head of the Karmis family, saw his daughter and immediately realized that she had caused trouble again. "Why are you back so early, Amy? Did you skip school again today?" he asked, his voice stern. Amy pouted and replied curtly, "I've learned everything. It's no fun, father." After saying that, she went upstairs without looking back. Shakura sighed, shaking his head helplessly. "Gosh, I wonder when she'll grow up," he muttered, his eyes filled with worry as he watched his red-haired daughter disappear up the stairs. "Even if you're a genius, you can't be so careless," Shakura said, his voice gentle but with a hint of reproach. "Otherwise, one day, you'll be outdone." He was just saying it casually, but the last sentence accidentally hit Amy's sore spot. Today, she had really been outdone, and the person who did it was a commoner. Seeing Amy suddenly fall silent, Shakura was surprised. Normally, when criticized by her father, she would argue or get angry. But today, she just sat there pondering for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, Amy spoke up, her voice serious, unlike her usual mischievous demeanor. "Father, about magic. Do you know anyone at the Magic Academy to introduce me to?" Meanwhile, after the stormy journey, Shirone finally found Vincent. Upon seeing his father, he threw himself into his arms, tears streaming down his face, crying and complaining, "Father, I'm lost. I'm so scared." Vincent hugged him tightly, comforting him, his eyes filled with worry and sorrow, not knowing what his little son had gone through in this strange city. Shirone and his father returned to the small village, but from then on, his personality changed dramatically. The cold winter came, and snow covered everything. The next morning, when Vincent returned home, he saw Olina sitting knitting a scarf, looking worried. She said Shirone went to the logging area to cut more firewood, even though it's snowing heavily outside. Hearing this, Vincent was worried, immediately put on his coat, and went to look for him. Although they were not biological father and son, Vincent had raised Shirone since he was young, loving him like his own blood. With that fatherly love, he keenly noticed something strange in his son since the trip to the city in the spring. Shirone only said he was lost, but Vincent always felt that things were not that simple. His heart was heavy, knowing that he was hiding something. At this moment, Shirone was in the forest cutting firewood in the middle of a snowstorm. Even though many days had passed, he still could not forget the moment he unconsciously cast magic and sent those thugs flying that day. The feeling of power exploding, the tornado obeying his will, it was all engraved in his mind. Shirone clenched his fists, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air, his eyes sparkling with new determination, as if he was trying to understand that mysterious power better. Since that day, Shirone has not been able to reproduce that magic even once. The tornado the day before was cast purely by instinct, but without any basic knowledge of magic, he was helpless. However, Shirone did not give up. Now, he had mastered entering the spirit world. In that state, all his senses seemed to explode. From shape, scent, to feeling, he could perceive all the information about the tree in front of him in just a moment. He even saw its weakest point, a small crack where sap oozed out. With absolute concentration, Shirone swung his axe. With just one clean strike, the tree 5 or 6 times taller than him fell to the ground. The sight caught the eyes of Vincent, who had just come to find him. As a seasoned hunter, he was stunned. He bet that what he had just witnessed was a thunder strike. a rare technique where a single strike of his axe hit a weak point and brought down a large tree. But looking at Shirone's sharp eyes and strange concentration, Vincent had a feeling that this was more than just technique. There was something more magical, something deeper going on inside his son. Vincent stood there, looking at Shirone, the small, skinny boy, with a surge of emotion in his heart. How could a child like him be able to perform Thunder Strike, a technique that even a seasoned hunter like him would have difficulty doing? Looking at his son carefully sawing the tree trunk in the freezing cold of winter, with the snow falling white, Vincent couldn't help but let tears silently roll down his cheeks. He was proud, but also felt sorry for his boy. Meanwhile, Shirone was filled with excitement. This was the first time he had successfully created a lightning strike after countless times of cutting down trees. The feeling was exactly like the moment he unconsciously cast magic to blow away the thugs in the past. He knew he wasn't as lucky as the children of the nobility, who had received proper education and access to knowledge from a young age. But that couldn't extinguish the burning desire in him, the desire to grasp the fundamental knowledge of magic. Shirone smiled, her breath creating white smoke in the cold air. Tomorrow, the day after, and the days after that, he would continue to train, continue to enter the spiritual world, to feel the magic, because he was sure that the opportunity to reach the dream of becoming a mage would come one day not far away. He held on tightly to his spear, his eyes shining brightly, as if the whole world was waiting for him to conquer. Persistence has brought Shirone amazing results. 3 years have passed. The skinny boy has grown taller. His blonde hair has also grown longer, fluttering in the wind. Shirone can now create lightning strikes that hit the target every time. Each strike is as precise as an arrow hitting its target. He seems to be immersed in nature, feeling the subtle movements of each bush, the rhythm of insects, even the flow of nutrients through the roots. But Shirone knows that this is not the limit. If he continues to practice, a new, larger world will open up before his eyes. Today, Shirone spent 5 hours meditating in the forest, immersing himself in the spiritual world to hone his senses. After reaching the desired state, he carried the pile of firewood, walking lightly back home. On the way, he suddenly saw 2 magnificent white horses. This precious breed of horse rarely appeared in such a remote area. When he returned home, Shirone was even more surprised. A luxurious carriage was parked right in front of the yard. He immediately guessed that his house had guests, and certainly not ordinary people. Shirone entered the house and immediately felt the tension in the air. Both Vincent and Olina looked worried, which made him uneasy. "You're back?" Vincent said, his voice trembling slightly. "Come here, meet this person." The owner of the luxurious carriage in the courtyard was a man who introduced himself as Temuran, the head steward of the Ogent family, the second-ranked noble family in the kingdom. Shirone didn't understand why such an important person would come looking for him, but he still bowed politely. Temuran walked over, observing Shirone from head to toe, his eyes sharp as if he were evaluating a treasure. He looked at his face, his tall and thin but sturdy figure, then suddenly asked, "Can you read?" Shirone replied modestly, "Yes, I learned a little when I was young." Temuran pondered, nodded, and continued to observe him. "You were raised well," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Just a hunter's son, and yet he knows how to read. Moreover, he is a good kid." Shirone stood there, his heart pounding, not knowing what this man's true intentions were, but his intuition told him that this encounter would change his life forever. "Wait, can you tell me what you're here for?" Shirone spoke up, his voice showing a hint of impatience. Temuran smiled slightly, finally revealing the purpose of his visit. "I'm here to bring you back to work for the Ogent family," he said, his eyes still fixed on Shirone. He was surprised, not understanding how a noble family like the Ogent family knew about him. Temuran continued, "The job is to move 10,000 books out of the mansion's main library. Many of them are very important. This will be completed in 2 years. Others will take care of the transportation, but the sorting of the books will be done by you and me alone." Hearing the word library, Shirone's heart pounded. The Ogent family's library, a place that definitely contained a wealth of valuable knowledge, especially regarding magic. He could hardly believe his ears, his eyes sparkling with excitement. But Temuran lowered his voice and continued, "Only your family knows about this. No one else here is allowed to know about this job." Shirone glanced at his parents, saw Vincent and Olina exchanging worried glances. He clenched his fists, feeling both excited and uneasy, knowing that this offer could open a new door, but also full of risks and mysteries. "If even one book gets out, or news of this gets out, your life and that of your family will be in danger," Temuran said, his voice cold but full of weight. Shirone froze, finally understanding why Vincent and Olina were so worried. His parents' faces were tense, their eyes heavy. Temuran continued, "Of course, because this job is dangerous, the Ogent family is willing to pay a large sum of money that you, Vincent, could not earn in your whole life of hunting." He looked at Vincent as if to emphasize the value of the offer, but Vincent did not care about money. To him, Shirone was a priceless treasure, incomparable to anything. He agreed to Temuran for one reason only, to let his son read freely in the famous Ogent family library, which contained the knowledge he had always craved. This is enough to make up for the years you took care of the boy, Temuran said, turning to Vincent, his eyes filled with satisfaction as he studied Shirone. He is indeed a good choice. Shirone stood there, his heart pounding, feeling the weight of this opportunity but also the promise. He glanced at his parents, his heart filled with determination, knowing that this could be the turning point to reach his magical dream. Temuran's words were like a sharp knife, implying that Vincent had raised Shirone for so many years just for money. Vincent immediately stood up, slammed his hand on the table and glared, "I'm not after money. I just want Shirone, my son, to fulfill his dream." Temuran burst out laughing, his voice full of sarcasm. "Ha ha! Why are you so nervous? Do you think he will have a great career? Stop dreaming. If it wasn't for money, then why did you beg me to choose my son?" He curled his lips, his eyes filled with mockery. Vincent blushed and roared, "You said he knows how to read? My wife, Olina, taught him a few words when he was young, just for fun. But no one expected that when he was 5 or 6 years old, Shirone would pick up a book and read it himself, learning by himself." Remembering the image of the little boy Shirone back then, obedient, adorable, sitting attentively next to the old books, Vincent's eyes lit up with pride mixed with sadness. He didn't just read, he understood. He was hungry for knowledge. That's why I wanted him to have a chance, not because of your damn money. Shirone stood there, his heart aching, watching his father defend him against that powerful man, and he was more determined than ever to not let Vincent down. But above all, Shirone was a smart child, Vincent said, his voice low but full of pride. Every time he looked at his bright blue eyes, or at the way he read his books, he couldn't help but wonder, was his adopted son of noble birth? What would his life have been like if Shirone had been raised by a noble family instead of growing up in a simple hunter's house like theirs? Would it have been better? Throughout those years, Vincent had struggled with his own inner conflict. Part of him wanted to keep Shirone for himself, to teach him to be a hunter, a woodcutter like himself, to live a simple life. But every time he saw Shirone spend hours in the forest, diligently swinging his axe, sweat soaking his shirt, his heart ached. He knew the boy deserved wider horizons. That was why Vincent himself had taken the initiative to seek out Temuran when he heard that the Ogent family needed a literate commoner. He didn't want Shirone to be stuck in the small village forever, even though his heart ached at the thought of being away from him. Looking at Shirone standing there, eyes shining brightly, even though still a little worried, Vincent told himself that he had made the right decision for his son's dream. He was willing to sacrifice everything. All Vincent wanted was for Shirone to set foot in the Ogent library, to read the books he had always wanted. So he humbled himself and went to Temuran, begging him to give his son a chance. But he was not surprised that this arrogant man would think that Vincent was willing to sell his son for money. Temuran's words were like a knife, stabbing into his pride. Vincent stood up abruptly and roared, "I don't need a single penny. If I knew you would look at me with such contempt, I wouldn't have begged you. Now get out of my house." Temuran, who was also arrogant, was scolded by Vincent to his face. He snorted coldly, fixed his clothes, and turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, Shirone's voice rang out resolute. "Wait!" He looked straight at Temuran, his eyes burning with determination. "I will take this job, even if it is dangerous or makes you look down on my family. I'm serious." Temuran stopped, turned his head, and looked at Shirone with a cold gaze. "Are you serious?" "I'm not joking, kid. This job is no child's play." Shirone clenched his fists, nodded, and said firmly, "I understand. I want to do it." Vincent and Olina looked at him, both proud and worried, knowing that this decision would send Shirone on a challenging journey where his magical dreams could come true or be shattered. "I'm telling you, even the slightest rumor could cost you your life," Temuran warned, his voice as cold as ice. But Shirone stood there, his gaze unwavering. "I will keep my mouth shut under any circumstances," he declared firmly. "And if anything happens, I will not hold any grudges against you or the Ogent family." Seeing the determination burning in the young man's eyes, Temuran did not bother to advise him further. "I will send a car to pick you up within a week," he said. "During that time, if you change your mind, you can withdraw. No one will force you. But once you set foot in the Ogent mansion, you will not be allowed to leave until the job is done." After giving his instructions, Temuran did not linger long. He walked out, leaving the family of 3 alone in the small house. When only Vincent, Olina, and Shirone were left, Vincent looked at his son, his voice low and full of worry. "Do you really want to do this, Shirone? You know how dangerous it is." He paused, his eyes filled with both pride and sorrow, waiting for an answer from the boy he had raised like his own son. "Shirone, why did you agree to such a request?" Vincent choked, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Those bastards just wanted to find a scapegoat. This is my fault. I will take responsibility, so you should refuse right away." Shirone looked at his father, his eyes also red, tears falling. But he did not cry because he blamed Vincent for putting him in danger. On the contrary, he cried out of deep gratitude. The opportunity to enter the Ogent family library, to touch precious magic books, that was a dream that Shirone had never dared to think of in his entire life. "Father, thank you so much," Shirone said, his voice choked but his lips curved into a bright smile. Vincent quickly hugged his son tightly, comforting him, his voice trembling. "Don't worry, Shirone. You have to come back safe and sound. Understand? I swear they won't touch a single hair of our family." The two of them hugged each other, tears mingling, but in Shirone's heart was a fire of determination. He knew the road ahead was full of dangers, but it was also an opportunity for him to reach his dream of becoming a wizard, and he would not let his parents down. At that moment, Vincent really didn't know if his decision was right or not. Olina couldn't hold back her tears either, her heart aching for her son. But when they saw Shirone's determined gaze, they both understood that they couldn't keep him. A week later, as promised, Temuran sent someone to pick up Shirone. After having Vincent sign a commitment, they hurriedly put him in the carriage. The carriage door slammed shut, and the wheels started rolling. Shirone, at that moment, fell into a mental state. In that state, he clearly saw Vincent and Olina hugging each other, sobbing on the side of the road. His heart ached. His instinct urged him to reach out, wanting to touch his parents again. But reason pulled him back. His hand stopped in midair. That's right, this opportunity was a double-edged sword. Working for the Ogent family was full of risks. It could even take his life at any moment. But at the same time, it also opened up a new horizon, where Shirone could reach the magical knowledge that he had longed for all his life. He took a deep breath, his eyes burning with determination, ready to face what awaited him at the Ogent mansion. Shirone clenched his fist, determined not to falter. Speaking of the Ogent family, their main residence was located in Greece City in the Tormia Kingdom, quite far from the capital Bazooka. The Ogent family was a famous warrior family that specialized in training outstanding swordsmen. The previous head of the family was a third-rank swordsman, while the current head, Bishop Ogent, was a powerful fourth-rank knight. With that power, they easily controlled the forces in the city. After a long journey, the carriage finally stopped in front of the Ogent residence. It was Shirone's first time entering a noble family, and it was the second-ranked family in the kingdom. The magnificent sight before him overwhelmed him. Tall stone pillars, a lush garden, and an intricately carved iron gate. The two people in charge led him to a room that served as both an administrative office and a resting place for the butlers, which was also where Shirone would live for the next 2 years. He stood there, heart pounding, both excited and nervous, knowing that his journey here would shape his future. Temuran was already waiting there. Without giving Shirone a moment to rest, he immediately led him to the Ogent family's great library to explain the mission. When he entered the library, Shirone was completely overwhelmed. He had never seen so many books before. Tall shelves, thousands of leather-bound books, yellow paper, exuding the scent of ancient knowledge. For a book lover like Shirone, this was no different from heaven, Temuran explained. The Ogent family had built a new library, so all the books here needed to be moved. Shirone's job was to organize them. Every week, he would receive a list, and based on that, he would find and collect the requested books. Working hours were from 9 in the morning to 6 in the evening every day. Outside of those hours, Shirone was allowed to rest, but he was absolutely not allowed to leave the library area or enter the manor without permission. Shirone nodded, his eyes sparkling. Although the job sounded strict, he couldn't help but feel excited. Living among books, even for just 2 years, was an opportunity he was willing to give up everything to grasp. He clenched his fists, ready to begin, silently telling himself that he would take advantage of every moment here to learn, especially about magic. Temuran, as the head butler, was busier than he had expected. "Apart from me, there will be other butlers to teach you the ways of the family," he said, then glanced at Shirone. "Do you have any questions?" Shirone was still pondering the information he had just received, feeling that this was indeed a worthwhile opportunity. He looked up and asked back, "When do I start working?" "Tomorrow," Temuran replied curtly. The next morning, Shirone, dressed in his new butler uniform and holding a list of books, entered the great library. After a sleepless night of thinking, he gradually understood why a powerful family like Ogent would hire only one person to arrange the books. Perhaps they needed a uniform standard. For example, arranging a book titled History of Swordsmanship would require careful and consistent work to ensure that every book was properly classified and not mixed up. Shirone took a deep breath, eyes sparkling with determination, ready to start work, knowing that every day here was a step closer to her magical dream. Different people might have different opinions on whether a book like Swordplay History should be classified as a professional swordplay or a comprehensive history. But as Shirone experienced the sorting system, he realized something profound. All knowledge is interconnected, and the core thread that connects them is history. Knowledge is built on a straight line called history. It is the backbone of all knowledge. After thoroughly studying history and using it as a foundation to strengthen other fields, Shirone's reading speed skyrocketed. Of the 10,000 books in the Ogent library, about 850 were about history. Shirone set a goal of reading them all in 2 years here, considering it a stepping stone to realizing his greatest dream, becoming a magus. Time passed slowly, but Shirone quickly adapted to the work. He worked hard, his eyes always shining as he turned the pages of the book, as if each book was a puzzle piece that brought him closer to the magical world. He immersed himself in the sea of knowledge, arranging the books and studying, his heart filled with determination and hope. That night, in the dim light of the library, Shirone was engrossed in reading when he suddenly heard footsteps. It was Temuran, along with a deputy butler, approaching. Shirone hurriedly put away the book, his heart pounding. After all, reading here was not allowed, and he did not want to be discovered. "Are you done arranging? Working overtime again?" Temuran asked, his voice low and even. "Yes, sir." Shirone straightened up and answered quickly, trying to hide his confusion. Temuran did not suspect anything, only instructing, "Don't let your body get too exhausted. You still have 2 years here. More importantly, you must take responsibility for everything you do. If you get tired and make a mistake, your head will be separated from your neck without you knowing it." After saying that, he placed the new book list on the table and turned to leave. But after a few steps, Temuran suddenly stopped, turned around and walked straight towards Shirone. He was startled, extremely nervous, feeling as if his secret was about to be exposed. Sweat beading on his forehead, Shirone stood still, waiting for what Temuran was about to say, silently praying that he wouldn't find out he was secretly reading. Shirone was shocked, thinking that Temuran had discovered him reading while working overtime. Fortunately, he only walked over, adjusted the bow tie on his collar, and looked stern. "There are not only butlers in this library, but also the family head and the young ladies and gentlemen who come by. Be careful with your uniform, and make sure you don't bring shame to the Ogent family," Temuran said, then glanced at Shirone's long hair. "Cut your hair. It will look neater." With that, he turned away. Shirone let out a sigh of relief, as if a burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He briefly thought about cutting his hair short and neat like Father Vincent, but then dismissed it. There was something much more important to worry about. The knowledge in the books was too difficult. Once Temuran and the deputy butler had left, Shirone sat down again, facing the vast sea of formation. The history books, philosophy books, and even notes on magic made his head spin. But he was not discouraged. Each page of the book was a brick that built his dream of becoming a mage. Shirone took a deep breath and turned another page, his eyes burning with determination, ready to conquer the challenge ahead. Shirone wanted to memorize it quickly, but he realized that in order to access the knowledge in the book at any time, he had to understand every event and every detail, so he buried himself in his head again. But after a day of hard work, his body was exhausted. Drowsiness came over him, and Shirone couldn't resist it, falling asleep on the table, falling asleep among the pile of books. While he was sleeping soundly, a hand quietly reached out and picked up the book Shirone was reading. It was Temuran, who had returned at some point. He looked at him, shook his head, and clicked his tongue. "You're really stupid," he muttered to himself. "Holding this book for a whole month. Do you think just memorizing it will make you successful? If you read some practical books, I would have banned you from staying here outside of work hours a long time ago." He put the book down, his eyes softening slightly. "But luckily, you're just a fool with willpower. A fool, but worth a look." Temuran turned away, leaving Shirone sleeping peacefully on the table, the moonlight filtering through the window illuminating his face, which still held a determined look despite his exhaustion. 3 months passed, and Shirone had gotten used to the pace of life in the Ogent family's great library. In addition to the work of arranging books, he also learned many things from the maids, from proper manners to the small details of noble life. Over time, Shirone realized a truth. The nobles did not care too much if 1 or 2 books were lost. That implied that there were probably no truly important books in this library. But he did not let his guard down. Danger still lurked, and Shirone always remembered Temuran's words. Even a small mistake could cost him and his family dearly. Therefore, he was always careful, not allowing himself to make any mistakes. While he was lost in thought, the door to the great library was suddenly pushed open. The loud noise startled Shirone. A sharp voice pierced his eardrums. "Damn that damn old man!" Shirone looked up abruptly, his heart pounding. The person who had just rushed in was a tall, blue-haired young man with an overwhelming aura. He walked in, his eyes blazing with anger, clearly not someone he could take lightly. Shirone stood still, trying to stay calm, but he couldn't help but feel anxious, not knowing what was about to happen. Shirone immediately recognized the person who had just rushed in was Rian Ogent, the youngest son of the Ogent family. Before he could come to his senses, another voice, more authoritative and terrifying, rang out from the door. "Rian, you dare to run away? If I catch you, you'll have to run another 100 laps." Rian, without saying a word, rushed towards Shirone and dove under the table next to him. Before hiding, he glared at him and whispered, "Don't tell on me that I'm hiding here, understand?" Rian's tall figure put a terrible pressure on Shirone, but the person who entered the library right after him was even more terrifying. A giant man, his body many times larger than Ryan's, towering like a mountain. "I know you're hiding here, Ryan." The man roared, then turned to Shirone, his eyes sharp as knives. "Hey, kid, did a green-haired kid, as tall as a bean, just run in here?" Shirone was stunned. If Rian, with his large body, was called a bean, then what was he, skinny and small, in the eyes of this uncle? He stood still, his heart pounding, trying to keep a calm face, not knowing how to answer to avoid trouble from both sides. Shirone was so scared that he trembled, but he still mustered up his courage and stammered, "Excuse me, may I ask who you are?" "I am the swordsmanship teacher." The man roared, his voice as loud as thunder. "I am the one authorized to beat that bean into a pulp, understand?" The two words "understand" seemed to pierce Shirone's eardrums. He felt that if he didn't answer right away, this uncle might really beat him into a pulp. Even though Rian had warned him not to tell the truth, Shirone had no choice but to tell the truth. "Yes, he's hiding under the bookshelf over there." Rian's swordsmanship teacher immediately rushed forward, grabbed Rian by the collar with one hand, and dragged him out of his hiding place like a cat. "Master, this is just a misunderstanding," Rian frantically tried to explain, but the teacher didn't listen. With a strong throw, Rian was thrown to the floor, dust flying everywhere. Not giving him time to protest, the teacher grabbed Rian by the collar and dragged him outside, despite Rian's struggles and screams. Shirone stood there, his heart still pounding, both worried that he had caused trouble and surprised by the swordmaster's incredible strength. He silently told himself to be more careful, because in this place, even a young master like Rian was treated like that, so he, a commoner, had to be even more cautious. "Follow me, you scoundrel. You dare to neglect your training. I need to teach you some sense," the swordmaster shouted, dragging Rian away like a sack. Rian turned back, his face filled with pain, his mouth clearly forming the words to Shirone, "You will pay." But Shirone could only stand still, thinking to himself, this master was so powerful that he even surpassed the family head. He had no choice but to tell the truth. After that day, Shirone heard rumors that the youngest son, Ryan, was taken to the mountains to cultivate. Thanks to that, the following days, the library was quiet, no one suddenly barged in and startled him anymore. Shirone continued to work regularly at the great library, arranging books while taking the time to read. The first book took him 20 days to read and understand, but after mastering the approach, he read 82 books in just 4 months. Each page was a piece of the puzzle, bringing Shirone closer to his dream of becoming a mage. He looked down, his eyes shining, as if the whole world of knowledge was opening up before him. Everything went as Shirone had predicted. The beginning was difficult, but once he got through it, none of the books contained anything completely new. If he built a solid foundation with the first 200 books, the remaining 650 would be much easier to absorb. As he read the books about the history of the origin of magic, Shirone began to wonder, was studying the history of magic really the right choice at this time? But having learned about the formation of all things before, he was even more certain that he was on the right track. He realized, if a scholar creates a theorem, then a magician does the same thing. But they also have to realize that theory, turn it into practical power. Shirone flipped through the pages, his eyes shining, feeling like each line was bringing him closer to the mystery of magic. He not only reads, but analyzes, connects, and builds a solid foundation of knowledge, ready for the day he can perform the magic he's always dreamed of on his own. Shirone became even more convinced a magician was like a scholar, but not every scholar was a magician. To become a magician, one needed to enter the unconscious state of the senses, the spiritual world, which not everyone could do. With his ability to enter the spiritual world, Shirone believed that if he could absorb the vast amount of knowledge from these books, he would become a true magician. He read intently, filled with hope, thinking that the peaceful days in the library would last forever. Until one day, the library door was kicked open and a deafening voice rang out, "Hey, you bastard! I've been through hell to wait for this day." It was Rian, the youngest young master of the Ogent family, returning with green hair, a tall figure, and eyes blazing with anger. Shirone broke out in a cold sweat, thinking to himself, this young master is really persistent. After going through the harsh training in the mountains, Rian still could not forget the grudge of being betrayed by him in the library that day. Shirone stood still, his heart pounding, knowing that big trouble was approaching. Rian gritted his teeth, his jaws chattering in anger. "Do you know how much torture I had to endure, you bastard?" he roared, then began to pour out stories about the days when his master tortured him. He climbed the cliff countless times until his fingers were numb and he had no strength left. But every time he thought he was about to die, Rian would remember the grudge in the library, remember Shirone, the one who betrayed him, and caused him to fall into misery. It was that anger that gave him the strength to overcome. Shirone sighed silently. This young master was not only vengeful, but his anger had gradually accumulated, now exploding like a volcano. "What? Don't you dare to open your mouth?" Rian shouted, his eyes bulging. "I asked you for help. I trusted you. And yet you turned around and reported me to my master. Just looking at your cowardly appearance makes me want to vomit." As he spoke, Rian grabbed Shirone by the collar and pulled hard, his eyes looking as if he wanted to devour him alive. Shirone stood still, his heart pounding, trying to stay calm. He knew that explaining now would be useless, but he couldn't let the situation get worse. Telling himself to find a way to appease Rian, he took a deep breath, preparing to speak, even though he knew that any word could ignite the anger of this blue-haired young master. "No, I'm just telling the truth," Shirone replied, his voice low but clear. "Don't make excuses," Rian roared. "You're the one who's wrong, daring to disobey me at that time." Shirone sighed silently. He knew that reasoning wouldn't work on someone who was burning with anger and much stronger than him. He changed his tone, calmly asking, "So, young master, what should I do?" Rian was stunned, not expecting Shirone to dare to ask the opposite question with such a calm expression. Then he burst out laughing, his voice full of sarcasm, and suddenly grabbed Shirone, dragging him to the sword practice yard even though it was the middle of the night. Shirone thought that Rian was going to use a wooden sword to hit him to vent his anger. He didn't want to lose the opportunity that his parents had desperately asked for, so he had to accept that he would stand still and take the beating. But after looking at the pile of weapons hanging on the rack, Rian suddenly chose a wooden sword and threw it to Shirone. "Take it!" he shouted, his eyes sparkling with an unfathomable intention. Shirone gripped her sword tightly, her heart tense, not knowing what Rian was planning, but clearly this was not simply a revenge beating. Rian pointed straight at Shirone, his voice full of challenge. "Fight me 1-on-1. I am not a coward like you. The price for daring to look down on me, the one destined to become a great swordsman, is that you will suffer the wrath of my sword." Shirone frowned, starting to lose patience at being constantly labeled a coward. He retorted, "What did I do that was cowardly, young master?" Rian roared. "As a servant of the Ogent family, you should have protected the Ogent family. Yet you betrayed me to your master just because you were afraid of being beaten. What is that if not cowardice?" As he said these words, Rian's eyes changed, becoming fierce, like a beast ready to pounce on its opponent. Shirone sensed the danger. He unconsciously tightened his grip on the wooden sword in his hand, his heart pounding. And that was exactly what Rian wanted, to provoke a reaction from him. Rian's lips curled up, his eyes sparkling, as if waiting for Shirone to respond, ready for a merciless fight. Shirone stood there, knowing that whether he wanted it or not, he had been dragged into a line that could only be resolved through confrontation. Because of the huge difference in skill level, Rian generously let Shirone strike first 3 times. Shirone was extremely nervous. Even though it was just a wooden sword it couldn't kill, but the wood was so hard if he broke his bones, he would have to go home, losing his job and precious opportunity at the Ogent library. In his mind, a question repeated over and over again, what should I do now? After a few seconds of thinking, Shirone tightened his grip on the wooden sword, mustering up all his courage to charge forward and attack. But the first strike, Rian easily dodged. His movements were lightning fast. The second strike, Shirone continued to swing his sword, but Rian only slightly leaned his body, using the wooden sword to block without wasting any effort. Unlike Shirone's clumsy and awkward appearance, Rian clearly had a solid foundation in swordsmanship with overwhelming power. His wooden sword was pressed against Shirone's neck, cold, as if warning him of the consequences if he failed. Shirone swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. He had only one chance to attack. His blue eyes flashed with determination. He took a deep breath, trying to concentrate, knowing that this final blow was not only to protect himself, but also to prove that he was not the coward Rian thought he was. If he failed this time, Shirone would lose completely. He focused all his spirit and entered the spiritual world. In that state, all of Shirone's senses were strangely sharp. He sensed the weakest point on Rian's wooden sword, just like when he found the weak point of a tree trunk to create a lightning strike when chopping wood. Having identified the target, Shirone immediately swung his sword to attack. Rian raised his sword to block, even smirking at his clumsy stance. But when Shirone's sword slashed down, the smile on Rian's face disappeared. Crack! Rian's wooden sword shattered into many pieces, falling to the ground. Rian was stunned, looking at the pile of pieces in his hand in horror, unable to believe what had just happened. Shirone's sword also broke, but he had succeeded. Rian gave him 3 chances. The first strike, Shirone felt the opponent's strength and rhythm. The second strike, he calculated the timing. And the third strike, he struck precisely, destroying Rian's sword. Shirone stood there, panting, his eyes sparkling with pride. Though exhausted, he had proven himself no coward, and deep down, he knew the spirit world had just helped him take another step towards becoming a mage. That's the lightning strike I heard about? Rian stuttered, his eyes still filled with surprise. Where did you learn swordsmanship? It's not swordsmanship, Shirone replied honestly. It's just lightning strike. Rian's eyes widened, his expression showing confusion. Shirone, seeing this, patiently explained, My father was a hunter. Since I was young, I followed him up the mountain to chop wood. Because my physique was weak and I couldn't chop wood like normal people, I found a way to hit the weak points of the trees to make chopping wood easier. Lightning strike is the name the lumberjacks gave to that move, Rian listened, becoming even more confused. A powerful, precise strike that could shatter his sword had been realized by Shirone just from chopping wood. He, a young master of Ogent, who had held a sword for 15 years and had received formal training, had lost to the son of a lumberjack. Rian stood there, still clutching the broken sword, angry and admiring, not knowing what to say. Meanwhile, Shirone just stood there, his eyes calm yet deep, as if he had just proven that strength did not come from swordsmanship or lineage, but from will and understanding. Shirone called the move Thunder Strike, but Rian was stunned when he realized it was the Ogent family's secret sure kill sword technique. His older brother Rai had learned this technique when he was 12 years old and had used it to defeat Rian. Today, Shirone, a commoner, had defeated him with the same technique. I will not accept this, Rian roared, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes bloodshot with anger. Seeing Rian's increasingly frightening expression, Shirone, who had just relaxed a little, immediately tensed up again. He stammered, Young master, did I make you uncomfortable? Shut up, Rian shouted, then pulled out another sword, this time a steel sword with a shiny blade, not a wooden one. He threw one at Shirone, his voice cold. Both of our weapons are broken, so this match is not over yet. Shirone caught the sword, his heart pounding. A real sword, no longer a joke. One small mistake could leave him bleeding, or worse. He looked at Rian, whose eyes were burning with anger. Shirone gripped the hilt of his sword, his heart in turmoil but still burning with determination. He didn't want to fight, but if he had to, he wouldn't let himself be defeated so easily. For himself, and for his parents who had sacrificed themselves for him to have this opportunity. If you have mastered the ultimate sword technique, I will treat you as a worthy opponent, Rian declared, his eyes blazing. Shirone felt like his heart was about to jump out of his chest. Don't tell me this young master is crazy, planning to fight him with real swords. Fortunately, Rian hasn't lost his mind to that extent. The real sword fight was real, but he gave Shirone a month to prepare. A month sounded long, but to Shirone, who had no foundation in swordsmanship, it was useless. He held the steel sword, his hands trembling, sweat pouring out. A real sword meant the risk of losing his life. Shirone didn't want to risk his life, and hurriedly begged, Young master, please reconsider. I have never learned swordsmanship. How can I fight with swords? But Rian didn't waver in the slightest. That's why I'll give you a month, he shouted, his voice cold, unyielding. Prepare yourself, I'll wait. Shirone stood there, his heart pounding, his hands still gripping the hilt of his sword. He knew he couldn't refuse, but he also couldn't risk his life for nothing. A month, that was the only time he had to find a way out of this predicament, and he had to make the most of it. If you can learn a deadly sword technique just by chopping wood, then somehow you will, Rian growled. And don't even think about running away, because I will definitely catch you. The steel sword in Shirone's hand wasn't too heavy, but he felt like it was crushing his heart. Returning to the great library, Shirone quietly listened to the information and gradually understood why Rian had reacted so strongly. It turned out that the Ogent family usually had two distinctive hair colors, black and blue. The Ogent clan leader, Bischoff, had black hair and had 3 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest son, who inherited the black hair, became a 6th-level swordsman, a genius in swordsmanship. The eldest daughter, with blue hair, had outstanding musical talent, so she was currently a musician in the royal palace, not following the family's path of swordsmanship. Shirone sat in the library, still clutching the sword, her heart in turmoil. He understood that Rian, with his blue hair and the pressure from his family, was eager to prove himself. But that didn't ease Shirone's worries. It would be impossible to learn swordsmanship from scratch in a month. He took a deep breath, his eyes shining with determination. If he couldn't learn the sword, he would use the spirit world, and what he had learned to deal with it. No matter what, he wouldn't let his chance at Ogentan, his dream of becoming a mage, slip away. The second son, Ogent Rai, also had black hair and had mastered the deadly sword technique at the age of 12 and was hailed as a genius. On the other hand, Rian Ogent was considered completely different from his siblings. The servants in the mansion all whispered that he was incompetent, even though he had a personal tutor. Shirone sat in the library, his heart filled with gloom. He regretted not letting Rian hit him with a wooden sword to finish things off, instead of fighting back, causing things to escalate to this point. Ryan's pride had clearly been severely damaged after losing to his Thunderstrike. It seemed that Ryan was determined to defeat Shirone in the upcoming match to dispel the psychological burden. Shirone was so nervous that he burst into tears. If he died in the match with Rian a month from now, his parents, Vincent and Olina, would definitely not be able to live in peace. Tears rolled down, but Shirone quickly wiped them away, gripping the steel sword tightly. He couldn't let fear overwhelm him. Even if he didn't know how to use a sword, he still had the spiritual world and the knowledge from the library. Shirone took a deep breath, his eyes flashing with determination. He would use this month to find a way to survive, not only for himself, but also for the people who had sacrificed themselves to give him this chance. Thinking of his parents, Shirone could not allow himself to sink into despair any longer. Just think, I will become a mage, Shirone, he told himself, his eyes flashing with determination. He stood up and began to search the library for useful books. Back when he lived in the mountains, Shirone had been very confident in his physical strength. He thought that if he learned some defensive techniques, he would definitely be able to survive the fight with Rian. So he threw himself into studying everything he could get his hands on, from books on defensive tactics to notes on body movements. Meanwhile, Rian also threw himself into his training like crazy. His unusual enthusiasm surprised his swordmaster. The student who had always tried to avoid training now actively requested more rigorous training. The teacher, with his vast experience, immediately realized that something had changed in Rian. Looking at the boy's burning eyes and determined sword swings, he thought to himself, something must have happened to make this kid change. Rian, with his pride wounded, was putting all his energy into preparing for the match with Shirone, determined not to lose again. Rian simply replied, nothing. Seeing his student's determination, the master did not ask any further, but immediately prepared a training plan that was even more rigorous, like a devilish training course. While Rian was sweating profusely on the training ground, Shirone was in the library carefully studying the force map, a simple diagram that describes the human body. If mages have a spiritual domain to perceive the world, swordsmen have a force map to understand their bodies. The force map helps swordsmen push their physical limits to the extreme, allowing them to perfectly control every cell in their body. This is the core element to become an excellent swordsman. Although completely different from the spiritual domain that Shirone had learned, the force map still made him curious and interested. He flipped through the pages of the book, his eyes shining, both memorizing and analyzing, trying to find a way to apply this knowledge to survive the fight with Rian. Shirone knew that even if he couldn't become a swordsman in a month, understanding strength could help him defend more effectively. And that was his only hope of confronting the young master Ogent, who was out there, full of energy. Should I try it? Shirone thought to himself. Having made up his mind, he closed the book, closed his eyes, and began to sense himself. This was the first step to opening the force map, and it was quite simple, similar to entering the spirit realm. However, if the spirit realm required erasing oneself to merge with the world, the force map required delving into one's own existence, feeling every breath, every movement of the body. But Shirone quickly realized that he did not want to put all his effort into the force map, which seemed to be the opposite of the spirit realm, the path that led him to his dream of becoming a mage. Instead, he changed direction, using the available spirit realm to learn some basic swordsmanship skills. Shirone brought a stack of swordsmanship books to the backyard of the library. He started with the simplest things: 8 directions of slashing, up, down, left, right, and 4 diagonals. With each slash, he tried to combine it with the concentration of the spirit realm, sensing the flow of air around him to adjust his movements. Meanwhile, Rian was still practicing furiously in the training grounds. He pushed himself to the point that even his swordmaster was amazed. The rigorous training, the relentless swings of his sword. Rian was like a relentless machine, determined to overcome all limits in preparation for the match. The swordmaster looked at his student, both proud and worried, knowing that the fire inside Rian was burning too fiercely, and the match with Shirone would not just be a competition, but also a battle of pride. The swordmaster had never seen Rian so agitated, even though he had taught him since he was young. Rian's mood was complicated, like an undercurrent. Shirone was just the last straw. The core problem was that Rian had always been compared to his talented older siblings. 15 years of sword practice. Yet he still hadn't unlocked his strength, something that made him considered a failure of the Ogent family. Despite his stern appearance, Rian's master was actually very affectionate. Today, witnessing his student's astonishing transformation, he couldn't hold back his tears. "Rian, that's enough," he shouted, snatching the sword from Rian's hand. "Let's stop here for today." Only then did Rian realize that his entire body was aching, as if it was about to fall apart. He obediently put down his sword, sat down on the ground, and looked far away. The heavy pressure from his family, from himself, was clearly visible in that empty gaze. The master stood by, silently observing, his heart both sad and hopeful. knowing that the fire within Rian, though fierce, needed to be guided lest it burn him out. "What are you thinking about?" Ryan's master asked, wiping away his sweat. "I think my arm is killing me," Ryan replied, his voice tired and tinged with humor. His master chuckled, then looked at him, his eyes full of pride. "Ryan, I never thought you could try this hard. But today, you did really well. Have you ever thought about what you did best?" Ryan shook his head, stunned. "I don't know. I only know the things I didn't do well." "Yeah, that's right," his master nodded, his voice low. "That's why you're not a genius." Ryan's face immediately burned, thinking his master was being sarcastic. He turned around intending to argue, but met his serious and deep eyes, as if filled with many thoughts. The master slowly said, "All geniuses know what they are best at. They only put their efforts into it when they are 100% sure they will do well." Ryan was speechless. The master's words were like a sharp sword, touching the pain deep in his heart. He lowered his head, his eyes distant, starting to ponder. Meanwhile, in the library, Shirone was still absorbed in his books and wooden sword, unaware that both of them, he and Rian, were fighting with themselves, preparing for a battle that was not only about swords, but also about will and self-esteem. "But geniuses also have a weakness," the master continued, his voice low but full of weight. "It is the persistence to conquer the impossible, a burning will to challenge the impossible. That will and determination are their nemesis." Ryan listened, the corners of his lips curling up into a faint smile. "Thank you, master. Of all the words of encouragement I've heard, I like this one the most." The master didn't just say it casually. Those words were like a spark, igniting a fierce fighting spirit in Rian. If talent wasn't something he had from the start, he would grit his teeth and hone it with hard work and practice. Rian wanted to use his determination to turn the impossible into possible. He yearned for victory. Coincidentally, that was also what Shirone was thinking. Right now, in the backyard of the library, he was diligently practicing basic swordsmanship. Under the moonlight, Shirone's every slash was clumsy yet full of will, as if each swing was a declaration of war against fate. Both Rian and Shirone were filled with determination, preparing for the upcoming battle where not only their swordsmanship but also their determination would be tested. Shirone put all his mind into the first few slashes, each one slow but serious. He understood that swordsmanship was not just a skill, but the art of taking another person's life, containing a fierce psychological battle of life and death. Without a partner, Shirone could only grip the steel sword that Ryan threw to him, imagining an invisible enemy in front of him who could attack from any direction. He knew that when using a sword, there were 8 main directions of attack. With extraordinary effort, Shirone practiced the 8 basic slashes on his own, and at the same time learned how to defend against those 8 directions of attack. He repeated them over and over, sweat soaking his shirt, each movement gradually becoming smoother. Through the days of practice, Shirone realized that swordsmanship, like magic, was also vast and endless. What he had learned on his own, although proud, was still like a grain of sand in the vast desert of knowledge. Under the moonlight, Shirone swung his sword, his eyes burning. He knew a month wasn't enough to become a swordsman, but every slash was a step forward, not only to survive against Rian, but also to prove that his will could overcome all limits. "Father, mother, I'm sorry, but I probably won't be able to return home this time," Shirone muttered, his voice low and full of pity, but since entering the Ogent family, he had never regretted it. Although this path was filled with the danger of death, he had witnessed a magical world where knowledge and magic opened up before his eyes. A month passed by in a flash. Shirone entered the training ground on time, facing a life and death battle with Rian. In just a short month, he could clearly feel Ryan's aura had completely changed, sharp, strong, like a newly sharpened sword. And Ryan could see the same thing in Shirone. A month ago, Shirone was still clumsy. His posture was awkward. His center of gravity was off. Yet now, he stood there, steady, steady. Even though it was her first time holding a steel sword, Shirone still maintained an amazing composure, her blue eyes shining with a steadfast will, ready to face this fateful challenge. Shirone's calmness reminded Rian of his brother, Rai, a sword genius. This only fueled the fire of victory in Rian. Rian charged forward, his sword swinging like lightning. Shirone was extremely nervous. Although the servants called Rian incompetent, his swordsmanship was on a completely different level than his own, who had only held a sword for a month. But thanks to his relentless efforts over the past 30 days, Shirone could still sense the direction of the blade. He was highly focused, his sharp eyes observing Rian's every move. That calmness made Rian's blood rush to his head. Why isn't this guy afraid of the blade? Rian thought, both angry and curious. In reality, Shirone wasn't reckless or fearless. But at this moment, he was completely in control of his emotions, guided by the spirit world. Rian continued to attack. This time the blade slashed from the right. Shirone leaned over, raising his sword to block the steel blades, clashing together, creating a deafening king. The sword shook in his hand, but Shirone remained steadfast, his eyes unwavering, ready to face the next blows from the blue-haired young master who was seething with fighting spirit. Rian's first few slashes were gentle, but from the following blows, his speed increased rapidly, far surpassing Shirone's ability to sense the direction of the sword. Finally, Ryan's blade drew a shallow slash across Shirone's chest. Fresh blood oozed out, staining his shirt red. Shirone gritted his teeth, knowing he was about to lose. Without hesitation, he used all his strength to quickly retreat, creating distance. In addition to the sharp pain from the wound, Shirone was also tormented by a puzzling question. Ryan, as if reading his eyes, curled his lips in satisfaction. "That's Ogent swordsmanship, training for the great sword," he declared. Each of Rian's slashes contained terrifying power, tempered through hard training, completely different from ordinary swordsmanship. The wound on Shirone's chest further stimulated Rian's fighting spirit. In his eyes, there was only one goal: to crush Shirone with absolute power. Shirone breathed heavily, his hand gripping the sword tightly, blood soaking his shirt. He knew that if he didn't find a way to turn things around, this battle would end with his life. His eyes flashed, trying to focus on the spiritual world, searching for even the smallest chance to survive Rian's sword storm. The two of them charged into the second round, but this time, Shirone was puzzled. If Rian had slashed upwards after attacking his chest, Shirone would have been hit in the ribs. But Rian's next moves weren't the finishing blows. This showed that Rian's swordsmanship was worse than Shirone thought. Although Rian was proficient at swinging his sword, he didn't seem to have a good grasp of how to use the moves effectively. This was the gap that Shirone could exploit to turn the tables. Without hesitation, Shirone changed his tactics, charging forward with all his might. Relying on the basic sword-swinging skills he had learned, he launched decisive, rhythmic strikes. Ryan was stunned, his eyes filled with astonishment. Why did he suddenly attack? Wasn't he exhausted? Ryan wondered, his heart in turmoil. Shirone, despite the blood still oozing from his wound, continued to press forward, taking advantage of Rian's confusion. Each of his sword strikes, no matter how simple, were guided by the concentration of the spiritual world, making them precise and unpredictable. Rian, who relied on his strength, began to waver, not expecting the one he considered a coward to be able to counterattack so powerfully. Rian became more and more confused. Shirone's moves were clearly simple, just basic sword moves, yet he could not block them. From the upper hand, continuously attacking, Rian suddenly fell into a passive position, awkwardly blocking each sword strike. Shirone realized that his opponent's stamina was decreasing through increasingly clumsy blocking movements. His hope of survival rose strongly. As long as he maintained his stamina and kept up this rhythm of attacks, he could win. Meanwhile, Ryan's mentality wavered violently. Shirone's dominance seemed to awaken ghosts of the past. He remembered his brother Rai, the genius praised by his father, who had defeated him with a deadly sword technique. Rai's arrogant, satisfied smile when he defeated him appeared clearly in his mind. Rian's anger exploded like a volcano. He roared, pouring all his rage into Shirone, swinging his sword with terrifying power, as if wanting to crush him to erase the pain of being overwhelmed by his brother in the past. Shirone could feel the terrifying change in Rian's demeanor. His blade was now not only fast, but also as heavy as a sledgehammer. He tightened his grip on the sword, trying to stay calm, knowing that if he didn't find a way to deal with this fury, all his efforts would be in vain. Rian's loss of composure made Shirone think for a moment that he had given up, but at that moment, a new problem arose. Ryan was indeed not calm, but the outburst of anger caused his sword swing and speed to increase rapidly, so fast that Shirone could not keep up with the sword's direction. In the final blow, Shirone felt as if the Grim Reaper was right next to him, the cold scythe touching his skin. But with the shining aura of a male protagonist, Shirone, of course, could not die easily. Neither of them hit the other. Rian's sword was blocked by Shirone, the steel blades clashing with a deafening kang. Rian stood still, his eyes blank, as if he could not believe what had just happened. Shirone was so tired that he was panting, almost exhausted, sweat soaking his clothes. Rian looked at Shirone, realizing that in the last moment, he had read the direction of his sword. A person who had never held a sword a month ago had actually blocked his full power attack. Rian clenched his sword's hilt, his heart in turmoil between anger and surprise. Shirone, though almost falling, still stood firm, his blue eyes sparkling with determination, as if declaring that he would not fall easily, even if his opponent was young Master Ogent. At the decisive moment, Shirone changed his stance with lightning speed. His sword swung up, directly hitting Rian's sword as it swung down. Using all his remaining strength, Shirone knocked Rian's sword away, causing it to fly out of his hand and fall to the ground with a clang. Shirone gasped, exhausted to the point of almost collapsing. He had won, but he still couldn't believe that he had actually defeated Rian. Even though he had won, Shirone still felt awkward. This was a contest of skill, but Ryan was a noble, and he, a commoner, had once again trampled on his already towering pride. Shirone was tense, worried about what Rian would do next. How far could his anger explode? He couldn't imagine. But this time, Rian didn't rage. He lowered his head, his eyes darkened, and said only 3 words, his voice hoarse. I lost. Shirone was stunned, looking at Rian, not expecting this reaction. There was no angry roar, no hateful look. There was only heavy silence. Shirone stood there, still clutching her sword, feeling both relieved and confused, knowing that this match was not just about swords, but would change something profound between the two of them. Before Shirone could come to his senses, Rian scratched his head and repeated the 3 words, I lost, a few more times, his voice flustered and a little embarrassed. I lost, and you won. Since I lost, even if you wanted to take my life, I couldn't say anything. Shirone was stunned, not expecting Rian to accept defeat so straightforwardly, even willing to give up his life. But he was a noble, the young master of the Ogent family. If Shirone touched even a single hair on Rian's head, how could he survive? What are you saying, young master? Shirone almost shouted, his voice filled with confusion. Rian shrugged and replied calmly, we fought with our lives. I lost, and I admitted it. Doesn't the winner have the right to take the loser's life? Shirone stood still holding his sword, his heart in turmoil. He didn't know how to respond to Rian's strange attitude, both arrogant and sincere. Rian's gaze was no longer fierce, but instead filled with a sudden respect, as if this match had changed the way he looked at Shirone. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, knowing that his next words would decide the direction of this tense situation. You're the one who wants to bet your life on this. I want to live, Shirone roared, his anger exploding. From the beginning, I thought this match was ridiculous. Why are you so angry and want to beat me when you're the one who ran away from your master because you're lazy to practice? Shirone's anger surged, making him lose all fear and bluntly criticize the young master in front of him. Rian, not willing to give up, immediately snapped back, his voice fierce. Wait, you bastard. Who should be criticizing who? It's all because of your cowardice. Even though it was the first time we met, in that situation, you should still respect me. Respect my ass. Shirone interrupted, her eyes bulging. Have you ever thought about how much trouble you've put me in? The atmosphere between the two of them was boiling, as if it was about to explode into a heated argument. Shirone, even though he had just won the match, still couldn't contain his anger at being dragged into such an unreasonable trouble. Rian, with his pride wounded, did not give in either, ready to fight to defend his honor. The two stood facing each other, their eyes blazing, neither willing to give in, as if this verbal battle was even more intense than the sword fight just now. I was stuck between you, the family head, and the sword master that day, Shirone shouted, getting more and more excited as he spoke. If you were truly worthy of respect, you wouldn't have put a lowly person like me in such a miserable situation. He poured out all his frustration, pouring out his anger on Rian like a flood. To be honest, Rian, this young master was just a rebellious boy, acting out of pride and fame, not really wanting to push Shirone to death. But for Shirone, he really thought that this time he had death in his hands, as if he was going to go to hell. After releasing all his words, Shirone was exhausted, panting, and sat down on the ground, still holding his sword. On the opposite side, Rian was scolded, as if he had been scolded by a servant without having time to wipe his face. But strangely enough, he didn't get angry. In the moment Shirone exploded, Rian felt that the cold, calm warrior he had just faced had disappeared. Instead, there was the real Shirone, a tired, straightforward boy, not unlike Rian himself when faced with pressure. Rian stood still, his eyes softening slightly, as if he was starting to see Shirone from a new perspective, not just as an enemy, but as a human being with real emotions. Instead, Rian saw a young man who looked about his age, no more, no less. Most importantly, although Rian felt that Shirone was clearly a genius, he did not mock or despise Rian like his brother Rai had done. Shirone fought with all his might, both to protect himself and to show respect for his opponent. This made Rian see Shirone in a different light, no longer as an enemy, but as someone worthy of respect. Hey, what's your name? Rian asked abruptly, his voice losing its aggressiveness. Arian Shirone, Shirone replied, his voice hesitant, not knowing what the other person meant. I'm Ogent Rian said, his voice clear, as if he was introducing himself for the first time. Shirone frowned, confused. Who wouldn't know that this blue-haired guy was Ogent Rian? His confusion reached its peak when Rian suddenly reached out his hand, intending to pull Shirone up. Following that was an offer that left Shirone stunned. Be my friend, Shirone. Shirone widened his eyes, looking at the outstretched hand, and Rian's face, no longer arrogant, only a rare expression of sincerity. He stood there, his heart in turmoil, not knowing how to respond to this sudden change from the young master who once considered him an enemy. Let's be friends. The fight between Shirone and Rian ended unexpectedly in a reconciliation. Shirone returned to his work at the Great Library, and in the blink of an eye, a year had passed since he entered the Ogent mansion. In total, Shirone had classified 7,000 out of 10,453 books of progress that far exceeded his expectations. Even Temuran, who was usually fastidious, couldn't help but give a rare compliment. As the number of books to classify had decreased significantly, Shirone's work efficiency had increased. Furthermore, his goal of reading 850 history books had now been reduced to 200. He read 3 books a day, devouring knowledge with an unquenchable thirst. In just a short while, Shirone would complete the knowledge base he had always dreamed of, bringing him closer to his dream of becoming a magician. He turned the pages of the book, his eyes shining, his heart filled with determination, knowing that every word he read was a solid step forward on the challenging road ahead. Not only did he gain knowledge from books, thanks to Rian, Shirone also experienced swordsmanship and understood the nature of fear. Those battles, though fierce, helped strengthen his spirit. Despite a slow start, Shirone believed that as long as he didn't give up, he would achieve his goal. More importantly, he found his first friend in life, Rian, who had shouted at him when they first met. After the duel, Rian stuck to the Great Library, always looking for Shirone to talk. Shirone gradually realized that Rian was emotional, even cute, completely opposite to his tall, muscular appearance. Although sometimes Rian still gave Shirone a headache, like when he rummaged through the pile of books he had just carefully classified. But overall, this friend was still very precious. Shirone smiled when he thought of Rian, feeling the warmth of friendship between the sea of books and the busy days at the Ogent mansion as a bright spot in his challenging journey. After becoming close friends, Rian started to show his lazy side again. For example, today, after reluctantly completing the basic training, he told his master that he wanted to go to the library to study, then went straight to camp beside Shirone. Shirone understood clearly. Although Rian was lazy on the outside, inside he was a smoldering fire ready to burst into flames when the opportunity arose. Rian would become stronger, just needed the right time, so there was no need to force him to practice too much. Shirone agreed to let Rian stay in the library, reading books together. But in less than 10 minutes, Rian was already tired, yawning at the pile of words. "Hey, didn't you say you wanted to become a mage?" Rian grumbled, his eyes glued to the pile of books. "Do you really have to read that much? 800 books? You're crazy, Shirone." Shirone laughed, turning another page, her eyes shining. "Yeah, crazy. But if you don't read, how can you understand magic?" he replied, his voice soft but determined. Rian shook his head, looking defeated, then lay down on the table, but still stayed, as if Shirone's persistence had a strange attraction, making him reluctant to leave. Shirone glanced at his friend, smiled, and continued to immerse himself in the world of knowledge, knowing that despite Rian's complaints, their friendship was still the driving force for both of them to move forward. "Of course, I'm actually falling behind," Shirone replied, his voice tinged with self-mockery. "Before I came here, I didn't have the chance to study. But now, after reading over 600 history books, I've learned quite a bit." Rian wasn't interested in books and just watched Shirone intently. Every time he saw him working, Rian couldn't help but be amazed. Shirone's reading speed was incredibly fast, as if he could be absorbed in the pages at any moment. Frustrated at only being able to read a few words, Rian started a conversation, breaking Shirone's concentration. Whenever the two of them were together, they would argue endlessly, like a never-ending battle. Shirone, distracted, couldn't read anymore, so he turned to argue with Rian about the book he was holding loosely in his hand. The book was about the most frequently compared topic on the continent, the difference between swordsmanship and magic. The two of them began to argue heatedly, Shirone defending magic with sharp arguments from books, while Rian insisted that swordsmanship was more practical, relying on real combat experience. Laughter and shouting echoed in the library, making the quiet space come alive, but also making Shirone think to herself, having this friend is both fun and annoying. "The swordsman will definitely win," a voice rang out from behind the bookshelf. Shirone jumped up in surprise, his heart pounding. The owner of the voice was none other than Ogent Rai, the second young master of the Ogent family, the elder brother that Rian hated so much. Shirone was extremely nervous, worried that the heated argument between him and Rian had been heard by Rai. A servant like him daring to speak impolitely to the young master of a noble family would definitely not be let off easily. Rai's cold gaze seemed to pierce through Shirone at this moment, making him even more uneasy. Seeing Shirone flustered, Rian immediately spoke up to relieve him. "How can you be so sure? Do you know the result? Or are you just defending the swordsman because you are a swordsman yourself?" Rian curled his lips, his voice full of challenge, intentionally drawing Rai's attention to himself. Shirone stood still, trying to stay calm, but his heart was still pounding. Rai slowly stepped out from behind the bookshelf, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze sweeping over the two of them. The faint smile on his lips made the atmosphere in the library even heavier, as if signaling a new confrontation, not just with words, but also with the arrogance and pride of those with the Ogent bloodline. Oh, I didn't expect you to care so much. Rai curled his lips, his tone sarcastic. It's obvious from the status of swordsmen and mages on the continent. Ryan laughed heartily, without any restraint. We're talking about combat. What the hell does that have to do with status? People choose their positions on the battlefield based on their military rank, not that kind of thing. Surely you don't mean to say such nonsense, do you? Ryan's challenge was obvious, but Rai didn't bother to reply. Instead, he turned to Shirone, who was standing still beside him, his eyes sharp as knives. Hey, you, what do you think? It was just a normal question, but Shirone felt an invisible pressure weighing down on him. Rai's gaze seemed to be searching deep into his heart. Shirone couldn't guess his true intentions. If he didn't answer to Rai's satisfaction, would he still be safe? He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, his mind racing, to find an answer that would be tactful and not anger, this powerful second young master. Sir, Shirone spoke slowly, his voice cautious, I think both swordsmen and mages have their own strengths, depending on the combat situation. Swordsmen are good at close combat, while mages have the advantage at long range. The outcome depends on how they use their advantages. He paused, observing Rai's reaction, feeling uneasy, not knowing if this answer would be enough to ease the tension or just make things worse. Rai raised an eyebrow, a faint smile still on his lips, as if considering Shirone's words. Ryan, standing next to him, glanced at his friend, his eyes slightly worried but still ready to jump in if the situation turned. Despite his anxiety, Shirone couldn't avoid Rai's question. He cautiously stated his opinion. I think if the swordsman and the magician are of equal skill, it would be difficult for the swordsman to win once the magician has entered the spirit realm. But if the swordsman uses his superior physical strength to close in before the magician activates the spirit realm, they can definitely win. You're wrong, Rai interrupted, his voice cold. Without knowing when, he was standing right in front of Shirone. A head taller than him, Rai's aura was overwhelming, making Shirone feel as if he was being suppressed. The magician will lose, Rai declared, his lips curling into a smug smile, exuding an air of superiority. That smile drove Ryan crazy. Rai's arrogance, which he had hated since he was young, was clearly visible again. Ryan gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing, as if he wanted to rush into a duel with his brother. Shirone stood still, his heart pounding, trying to stay calm. He knew his words might anger Rai, but the defiant look from Ryan beside him told him that the situation was getting out of hand. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever Rai was about to say or do next, silently telling himself to be careful not to make things worse. Whenever Rai was upset with someone, he enjoyed trampling on what they held dear. Previously it was Rian. Now Rai turned his target to Shirone, wanting to crush him. He curled his lips, his eyes sparkling with provocative intent. You seem to love history. You must know about the 5 gods' armor, right? Sacred relics that can break the mental world of magicians. I'm talking about magic resistance. Shirone was stunned, clearly feeling the pressure from Rai. The 5 gods' armor, legendary sacred relics recorded in history books, famous for their ability to nullify magic, was the nightmare of every magician. He understood that Rai was deliberately attacking, aiming at his passion for magic. Ryan, standing beside him, clenched his fists, his eyes burning as if he wanted to jump in to protect his friend, but Shirone gently signaled him to calm down. He took a deep breath, his voice cautious but not trembling. Yes, I have read about the 5 gods' armor. They are indeed rare treasures, but resisting magic does not mean that a swordsman will always win. A good mage can use tactics to counter them, such as controlling distance or taking advantage of the environment, Shirone replied, trying to keep his voice gentle, but his eyes shone with determination, as if to say that he was not easily defeated. Rai raised his eyebrows, his smug smile faltering, seemingly surprised by Shirone's composure. Ryan, though still irritable, nodded silently, proud that his friend was not overwhelmed by Rai's momentum. The atmosphere in the library grew even more tense, like a hidden battle between will and pride.